My name is Ellen Rainey, and I graduated from Hamilton in 1987, and I work in the college's advancement office. And it's great to see you all, and a pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker. So I think a lot of you know Marianne Janack. She graduated from some college over in Hamilton, New York. I don't know. It might have been a junior college. I don't know.
That one. That college across the way.
College across the way. And also Syracuse University. And was appointed to the Hamilton faculty in 2001. Marianne is now the John Stewart Kennedy Professor of Philosophy. She has won Hamilton's Hatch Award for Excellence in Teaching and also the Richardson Award for Innovation in Teaching. And the classes she teaches, she's so good at teaching, include philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, feminist philosophy, and philosophy and literature. And for the past couple of months, like the rest of Hamilton's faculty, she's been teaching students who are at home from her own home. So it's really no surprise, I think, that she's been thinking about today's topic, which is Homeward Bound. So just a tiny bit of housekeeping before we get going. As we start, Allie has great power, and she's going to mute all of us except Marianne. And Allie will also be monitoring the chat window. So if you have questions, if something pops in your head while Marianne's speaking, you can type it in the chat window. And once she finishes her presentation, we'll turn to questions from the chat. So thank you all for being here. And Marianne, thank you especially. And over to you.
Marianne, I'm going to mute everyone first, and then I'm going to unmute you, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Now I'm going to see if I can do this fancy thing. Are you guys seeing my notes here? My quotes? So, you know, there's this like joke about hiring philosophers, you know, it's like we don't use even blackboards. We don't use any technology. So I have to say, this is the first time I've tried to do this on Zoom, is share something with you. But I wanted you to have some of these quotes because I thought they were really interesting. Let me tell you how I got interested in this topic. It actually started when my mother died in 2012. And my father died a few years before that. And so my sister and brother and I had to sell her house, which my sister did not want to do, even though none of us was going to live there. And so we had to move all the stuff out. And they had lived in that house since 1956. It was like this collection, you know, it was like an archaeological project. And so as we were moving things out, I was thinking more and more about home, and the house we lived in was this little tiny ranch house. It was just 860 square feet, we discovered when we went to list it with the realtor. And the realtor was, you know, insistent that we had to like make it not look like our family home. So he said, you know, get rid of the pictures, you got to paint everything white. You got to redo the floors, you got to rip up all the carpeting, like don't leave anything if you can avoid it. And I remember feeling, you know, slightly put out by that because of course you're thinking, wait, this is my family home, right? You know, that thing I won at the Solvay Field Days in 1982, I have to keep, you know, who would want me to get rid of it? It leaves a nice little personal touch. Well, come to realize, you know, people aren't looking to buy someone else's house, someone else's home. They're looking to buy a house that they can move into and live with their family and create it anew as their home. And so I started thinking about these issues about home and the fact that generally philosophers have not really thought about home that much. So I started digging around, reading stuff about home. And I came upon the fact that I didn't realize that Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of my favorite philosophers, actually built a house for his sister in Vienna in the late 1920s. And I was reading about that, and it's this very austere modernist house. And the first quote I have here for you is from another sister who was looking at that house when it was first built. And she said, even though I admired the house very much, I always knew that I neither wanted to nor could live in it myself. It seemed indeed to be much more a dwelling for the gods than for a small mortal like me. When you look at it, now this is the Bulgarian, this is the Bulgarian embassy in Vienna. And it is this, the sister, Gretel, who wanted this built, wanted a mansion. She wanted someone to build her a mansion in Vienna, and she hired this architect, Paul Engelmann, and then her brother Ludwig basically like barged in and started taking control of the whole thing. And so this house now, when it was initially built, the lighting fixtures were just bare bulbs. Like they were just bare bulbs that hung down, you know, from a cord. It is austere in you know, it's the definition of austere, really. And Wittgenstein himself actually spent a year designing the handles on the doors. And when you look at them, they don't look like who would spend a whole year trying to do that? But it's because it's just this little lever, you know. But this was like his major thing. He wanted to make sure that they were right. So the next quote I have for you is, I don't know if any of you watched this series called Midsummer Murders. Ah, Maddie does, yes. I think we've watched every episode so far. But anyway, there was an episode where there was this house where everybody kept getting murdered. But nobody wanted to leave this house, even though everyone was getting murdered in it. And so Tom Barnaby says, you know, when he's talking with his sidekick about like, well, why don't they leave the house? Like, it seems clear that you should leave this house where everyone who owns it and moves in gets murdered. And Barnaby says, well, you know, people are funny about houses. And of course, if you have owned a house, you know, if you think about your childhood house, you know, you can be funny about houses, right? I mean, objectively speaking, the house that I grew up in is not a house that I would want to live in now. But on the other hand, it holds this place for me that I keep going back to. And of course, my brother reminds me that this is nostalgic, that I've forgotten that, you know, these light switches didn't work and there was no room for all of us. And there were fleas in the carpet because the dog had fleas one summer and we could never get rid of the fleas. But on the other hand, you know, there's this sense that like, well, there's something about that place, even though if you were to just look at it like the realtor, you would say, yeah, I don't know who's going to buy this place, right? But this, of course, there's this cliche about the difference between a house and a home. And one of the things that we realize, you know, when we start dealing with these issues, or when we have our children home, or when we have to go home to the place where we grew up, is that, you know, home is an odd place. I mean, in some ways it's a place that we imagine as a place of return and comfort, but it's often a place that, you know, we have irrational attachments to, perhaps. So this next quote is one that I just loved, which is from George Carlin, which is, a house is just a place to keep your stuff while you go out and get more stuff. And if you didn't have so much stuff, you wouldn't need a house. You could just walk around all the time. And part of, part of what Carlin is getting at is actually a trend in the history of philosophy and talking about houses and homes, that they represent a certain sort of attachment to objects and to the past. And that really, if you're being properly philosophical or you're being a proper adult, you let go of that, right? You aren't attached to your stuff, or you shouldn't be attached to your stuff. You should be willing to let go of your stuff, and you shouldn't fetishize your stuff. And a house is just a place where the stuff is, or the house itself is an object that one ought not to be so attached to. But of course, as we say in philosophy, there are these different modes of looking at an object. And so you might look at it objectively, like you might just look at it scientifically or geometrically. A house is just a geometric object, right? It's divided up in certain kinds of ways. It has certain numbers of rooms. Things are arranged in those rooms in certain kinds of ways. And in some ways, it's interesting that in the history of philosophy, people, there's been discussion in contemporary philosophy that says that, well, philosophers have always been interested in home because they've been interested in space. And in the Enlightenment period, Descartes, space was a big topic. If you took analytic geometry or pre-calculus, you learned Cartesian coordinates, and that comes from Descartes. People like Leibniz invented the calculus. So space has always been, and then if you read Kant, obviously time and space, they go together. So philosophers have always been interested in space, but what's interesting is that they haven't been that interested in place. And that, I think, is where we have that tension in what it is to be a house and a home. It's not just a space, it's also a place. And in that way, it sort of evokes particularity, which I will tell you. I have a great book recommendation if you're all like sitting there like going, oh, I need another book to read. It is this book called Homesickness by Susan J. Matt. You can see it. And it's basically a history of the idea of homesickness, which she actually ties to nostalgia. And it seems that in the 18th century, nostalgia and homesickness were thought to be pretty much the same thing. That nostalgia was an irrational attachment to a lost time or a lost place. And homesickness was thought to be a similar kind of thing because it was this sort of parochial attachment to this particular place where you had been born or where you lived. In the early 18th century. So usually, in philosophy, we tie this to Kant and the idea of cosmopolitanism as an Enlightenment movement away from parochialism and toward a more universalistic approach. So the idea in some ways is that in order to be a citizen of a democracy and to be a modern person, you shouldn't be so attached to a particular place. You shouldn't be so attached to home. That part of what it is to be a grown-up is to be willing to leave your home and to make a new home someplace else, which then your children should be ready to then move on and leave. And if you're a parent, or well, if you're a child, you would, you probably recognize this too. When you go home, it's not the same, and not in the cliche way in which you can never go home. It's just that in some ways that idea of the home as the place where we were children, or the placeholder for the past, is at war with that idea of moving on and going on, say, to college. So, now that I'm doing these Zoom meetings with my students, they have very mixed emotions about being at home. Some, to some extent, they're happy to see their parents. And at first, I think they were quite happy to be able to go home. But now, so, we have our Zoom meetings, and there they are in their childhood bedrooms with their, like, stuffed animals and their, Pepto-Bismol pink bedrooms, and they have parents who are in the background, like, talking to them and demanding their attention, and they have siblings that they're trying to get away from them. In fact, one of my friends who's a creative writing teacher at Boston College told me that she was doing this class meeting with her class, and the mother of one of the students sat down next to the student so she could be part of the class too. And my friend told her to leave. She said, "This isn't for you, this is for these students." And the mother, I guess, was a little offended by this, because of course it's your house, right? Here's your kid on their screen, and they're doing something that you're probably paying the bill for, right? And so you think, well, I should just be able to sit down, right, and listen to what's going on in this class. But if you are someone who was a college student who then had to go home, I mean, you don't want your parents in your things, right? You don't want your parents in your life. You don't want them looking over your shoulder and acting like you're in elementary school. You are an adult, right? You're doing your own thing. And I can't even imagine how embarrassing it was for that student to have his mother in the picture. I would have been mortified if I were the kid. But anyway, so, part of what's happened with my project is that this whole thing has gotten way more complicated, I think, because whereas I was thinking about home as this nostalgic place, as this place of imaginative attachment, I now realize it's actually way more complicated than that. That home is the past, but maybe we don't always want to be attached to the past. And part of what's so challenging, I think, for our students being exiled from their home here at college to their childhood home, being forced to go back to that, is that, it brings into tension these two parts of their lives, their adult lives and their childhood lives. And if you're a parent, you probably, I assume, unless you moved someplace, you did what I did when your children went off to college, which is you didn't change their room at all. Their room is sort of a shrine to their childhood, and you sort of hold on to it and you don't let anyone, do anything to it. And then when that child comes home, like, they don't want those posters of, whatever band they loved when they were in high school, right? They don't want all that crap in that room. And then they start getting rid of it. And you think, but you can't get rid of that, right? That is the repository. That is your past. That is our past. But, if you're a grown child, you don't necessarily want to be thrown back into that. So the other quotes here I have, this is from Gaston Bachelard, who wrote a very important book called The Poetics of Space, which was one of the first books, this was in the early 20th century, to really take up the idea of house and home. And in that, Bachelard says that a house is for daydreaming, that what houses do is they sort of give us a space in which we can sit and daydream and think about futures and think about things that don't necessarily exist. I mean, just a place to relax in some way. And I have to say that for my students, at least, this is true, but it also works against doing your schoolwork, right? I mean, if you go home to be relaxed, to be with the people you love, then all of a sudden being asked to, you know, attend your geology class 4 times a week, or your philosophy class and talk about Kant, I mean, it just doesn't fit very well. And so I think for a lot of my students, what they're grappling with is this idea that their house is for daydreaming. It's a place to be creative, but now it's become a place where they're supposed to be doing work too, where they're supposed to be productive and they're supposed to be attached to this community of other scholars and students that doesn't have the immediacy and it doesn't have the compelling push that it would if they were here on campus and everybody has the same habits and everybody basically has the same kinds of daydreams. You know, they were thinking about college and the future in ways that when you go home, you aren't necessarily doing. The next quote is from another book that I've been reading, which I also recommend, although I'm not sure it gets as much right as the homesickness book, but it's a book by a bioanthropologist, and it's called Home, How Habitat Made Us Human. And the quote from him is that a home is a place for sleeping. And in that book, he argues that human beings, like other animals, make nests, and that a home is basically a nest. And that the thing that differentiates us from, say, other primates is that we tend to make a nest that we keep. We don't move around. Whereas when he was studying gorillas, he realized that they actually make different nests every night. And of course, this is very time consuming, right? I mean, you got to make your nest. You got to get all the, you know, the gorillas use these like particular kinds of twigs and sticks. And so they have to go searching for the sticks. And then they have to make the nest in the right place, right? But they won't stay there. They only do that for one night. So every night is spent making your nest, right? And Alan argues that part of what it is to be human, part of what has made us human, is this ability to stay in one place, to have a safe place to sleep, and to go back to George Carlin, to keep your stuff. And that allows you to make these forays out into the world, into the adventuresomeness of the world, that you can always have this place where you keep your stuff, and which is safe, that allows you to then venture out to college or to all the strange countries that Maddie Carlman has been visiting in the last year, or, you know, to go to New York and live the hard life of someone with a job, you know, that this safety is part of the process of developing as a human being. And so I wanted to close actually just with this last thought, which comes from W.G. Sebald, who is a poet. And he was writing about Germany in the World War II, post-World War II era. And his claim, which I found sort of late in all of this, is that going home is not necessarily a wonderful experience, that it always comes with a sense of loss and makes you conscious of the inexorable passage of time. And of course, this, I think, for those of us who are parents, is probably the thing that's so disturbing, and why we want to preserve this little shrine of our children's childhood room, it's hard to think, yeah, they're not children anymore. They are adults, and they're going to move out, and they're going to go on to have their own adventures and make their own homes. And the marking of that time is a marking not just of their growing up and changing, but of our getting older, right? Of our moving on to other homes, or having our children eventually have to clean all of our stuff out and sell our own houses. So I think what's really interesting about this, and I think what's interesting about this time, is that it is giving us, I mean, being home is challenging, I think, or at least it has been for me. I like going out in the world. I like seeing my students in real life. I like, my messy office. But there is a sense in which staying home makes you think more about that place. Whereas when it's just the place where you keep your stuff and that you venture out every day, it's a little easier to ignore it. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Now I want to hear questions or comments. I'm still working on this project, so.
Thank you, Marianne. I actually heard a preview of this. Marianne talked with faculty and staff through the Levitt Center a week or so ago, and I got a little preview, and I think it's fascinating having myself been in all of those positions of, being the child going home, having my parents sell the house that I used to go home to, having gotten rid of my parents' house, having a daughter who's gone away, like all of that. So I'm curious, and it looks like you have a lot of former students on here who I'm sure have philosophical input. So it's not a huge group here. So if you want to, literally raise your hand, I can call on you, or you can put a question in the chat or a comment. Madeline?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. That was really great. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about home as this space for daydreaming was that I moved around a lot this past year and slept in many different physical spaces and had to move my stuff in a lot of physical spaces. And I often, when I was traveling, had this expectation for creativity that I should be, writing a book or, producing something or creating something. And when I came home finally, it was as if this rush of energy, creative energy, came back to me, that I suddenly had the chutzpah to paint and to knit and to do all of these things that I otherwise hadn't had any motivation to do prior. And home took on an interesting meaning in that it became like the normalcy of it became a way for me to actualize sort of to another level of creativity or of processing, because I didn't have to process the sensory elements of the world around me. That like the street that I was walking down, I knew what the end of it looked like. Or the bed that I was laying in, like I had laid in my whole life. And so all of those things were known, which meant that like all the like little sort of questions that were in my mind otherwise could finally have space to breathe. So I don't know, that was just like my 2 cents on what you were saying.
Oh, that's really helpful. Sorry, I will just let you all know that I'm taking some notes. So I just like wrote down some of the stuff that Maddie just said, because that's really interesting, because you're right, in some ways the regularity of what is there, so I mean, I've never lived the life that you did. I remember in graduate school, I think I moved every year, which was, a horror show generally. I was like, load everything into the car, drive off to another small apartment in Syracuse. But I didn't have to move as much as you did into so many different places that in some ways you probably didn't have much choice about where you were, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks.
Victoria, yeah.
Just what Madeline was just saying made me think about how, and also what you were, Marianne, talking before about the gorillas and how they're constantly making their own homes. And maybe this is something that we've inherited through species and generations over time, but I've realized more since graduating from Hamilton, how adaptable we are as humans and how we adapt so many places to become our home. And that it's actually, at least for me personally, like it's fairly quickly to be in a place that will turn into feeling like a home, whether it's like moving apartments or even just going to like a friend's place. Like so often a sense of home has to do with also the people that you're around and with. And like maybe that is something that we've gotten from these other species, like our ancestors coming back, of how we can just so quickly adapt to these different places that we go to.
That's, you know, it's interesting because this this discussion in that homesickness book is talking about this idea of adaptability. And so now I'm gonna like now I'm gonna be critical of what you just said, because that's how she is in this book. Her argument is that this is like this idea of adaptability and flexibility and being able to pick up and move and make your home anywhere. And this this sense of being cosmopolitan is part and parcel of sort of a push toward a certain form of masculinity that's aligned with industrial workerhood. You know, so it's the idea that it's not necessarily that we're born with that sort of lack of attachment and ability to make our way. It's that we've sort of been taught to become that. And it's weird, isn't it, Victoria? Because, you know, I mean, this is part of what we try to teach at Hamilton, right? You know, it's like, don't be so parochial. You know, you shouldn't be overly attached to this little place where you live, right? There is this big wide world out there, and you should be willing to make these adaptations. But then I was thinking about this, you know, this Matt argument about homesickness. And she's really suspicious of that move, because she says, yeah, so interesting. It aligns, it arises, this sort of push to cosmopolitanism. It arises with the Enlightenment, with this distrust of the particularity of place. It becomes something that, you know, so she says that in the writings of medical doctors of the 18th century, there were certain people who were thought to be more primitive because they could not leave home. And those were mostly people of color. They were poor people, you know, people who are overly attached to home were seen to be not very good for building American empire. They were unwilling to go off to war, and they were unwilling to pick up and move to some city to take a job anywhere. So it's, I mean, so it's interesting. It's sort of this, like, as Victoria knows, I'm usually suspicious of the we are naturally or innately blah, blah, blah. So this is partly my pushing back against the innateness argument. But I also think it does bring up this weird duality of that ideal of, you know, being cosmopolitan and of not being, and of being flexible, you know. It's interesting. Thanks, Tori.
I think Andy had his hand up first, and then I saw you, Selena.
So, you know, I think this is a great topic, and it really, you know, for me brings like a flood of feelings for a number of reasons. And one thing I can share with you all here, because you've all had this experience, you know, I think of myself as being that kid and moving to Hamilton and moving into the residence hall and learning to have that independence of functioning in a very, you know, when I had a single in Dunham, let's say. in some sense, I learned to manage myself in that environment, and in whatever place I've ever moved to. Like, it's kind of like the bathroom is where I just kind of visualize. I had the dresser, okay, and I had a certain number of, hangers, and you could give me a big closet, but it seems like too much. And so there was something about being at Hamilton with I really liked, us all having the same, more or less space. But one of the things that you see me, I'm a doctor, right? So, the feeling that I'll be happier if, I have the bigger house and I fill it out with more furniture, and it becomes this endless, never ending, never satisfying thing. And so going through a divorce right now, I get to redefine my entire house. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself is a whole creative act, and kind of what some of you guys have brought up. I made a room. This is my room for thinking. I put all my philosophy books. I put all my mindfulness books. And I find that when you mention space, it's very helpful, I found, to get rid of all the clutter and just keep whittling down till you get the essential elements, so you can really be creative. But we get so cluttered in our lives that we really lose that space.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's so weird thinking about the objects, the way in which objects take on these important functions. So, Andy, it's funny, because, my experience at Colgate was like that too. But now I've been doing an MFA, a Master's in Fine Arts in Creative Writing at Pacific Lutheran University. And every summer I have to go there for 2 weeks, and I have to live in the dorms. And Andy, it's like, I know exactly, it's a tiny little room. It has the bare necessities. It has this little closet, right? Well, I think of it as little now. I mean, I'm sure it's totally fine. But when I move into that room, I go, oh my God, how do people live in this room? This is like barbaric, and you have to walk across the hall to the bathroom, and you have to make sure you don't lock yourself out of your room when you do that, and of course you have to wear your little shower slippers, because of course it's not your shower, it's this communal shower. And it's true, like because I fly from Syracuse to Tacoma, I just can't take that much with me, and there is something totally freeing about it, because it's like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna wear the same outfit for 4 days in a row, because you know what, I don't have any other clothes. This is what I have, and it's true, when you move into a new space, you can sort of let go of all this stuff. But on the other hand, I don't know about you, but I always feel so attached to such weird things, and I keep thinking, I just can't quite, like I see that Marie Kondo stuff, and I'm like, I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't get rid of all that stuff. That stuff is like, okay, maybe I don't look at it for 2 years, but what if I want to,
So it looked like Selena had her hand up, and I know Lloyd has his hand up after Selena. You're muted, Selena. There. Oh, we still can't hear you.
Here we go.
Oh.
Okay. Sorry, I have problems with those headphones. I'm Professor Janack.
Oh, Selena! My Selena. Oh, sweetie.
I know, I had you your first year at Hamilton.
I know.
Anyway, sorry for the fan club moment, everyone. But this was such an interesting conversation, and it made me think a lot about an article I read recently about homelessness and the way that, you know, when you are homeless, to connect to the George Carlin quote, you have nowhere to put all your stuff. And the way that that is then rendered somehow unlawful, and that you were out, you know, like that you are a criminal, like the criminalization of homelessness. And the way that, you know, the problem is you always have to have your stuff with you because it will be stolen if you leave it anywhere. But you have nowhere to store it, but also the criminalization of homelessness in the fact that you have no privacy. So, you know, any like intimate moments, practicing hygiene, things that we all take for granted as private things, you do not have privacy, and those things become criminal because now you're nude on the street. And just how interesting that is, sort of as the other side of the coin of home, and the safety and security that a home provides you, and the way that when you rip that apart, certain things you don't even think about as far as even going to the bathroom and how that works. And suddenly this becomes a matter of life and death. But such an interesting conversation. And just to tie it back to Hamilton, it reminded me, I think it was my sophomore year, I lived in Millbank, back when Millbank was like the whole football team, parties in Millbank 13 every night, you know? And I remember being at a party at Millbank 13 and then like going upstairs and walking one suite over and going to bed and being like, I live in the party, you know? And being so excited to be like, the party is at my fingertips in my home, you know?
Hey, Selena, can you send me that that article or a link to it?
Yes, yeah, I'll figure that out. I read it a little while ago, but I know I'll send that to you, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Lloyd Zuckerberg, it's good to see your name. I don't see your face, but you're next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not showing my face, not because I'm embarrassed.
Oop, now we can't hear you.
I'm not showing my face because I got to move a lot of things around to get the computer working. I need to buy one of those mounted cameras, but they're out of stock till like July. So here I am. So it's a pleasure to engage in lifelong learning, particularly at a school that I'm paying for. I didn't pay for my college; my parents did. But anyway, what I wanted to say is how interesting it has been that my children have all come home. My son Henry is a junior at Hamilton, rising senior. My daughter's a senior from Pittsburgh, just graduated. My other son's a rising senior at Westtown School in Pennsylvania, a Quaker boarding school. And how Henry in particular, the Hamilton child, is sort of walking around questioning all the stuff. This relates to some of the comments other people have made. And it's sort of that comment someone said, how can people live like this? I think.
Oh, we lost you, Lloyd.
Sorry. And he sort of is engaged in these cleanups where he's asking my wife, Mom, what is this? And do we need this? And why do we have this? And I ask the same questions and I get my head chopped off usually, but he's been able to do it in a way where they have spent, you know, a day cleaning up the kitchen and cleaning up the spice rack. And I mean, you name it, they're doing all kinds of stuff. But it's really interesting how they're at an age where they're starting to place value judgments on how we live our life. And, you know, it upsets me on one hand because we sort of want our children to be in our image. On the other hand, you know, it should make me happy to think that they're creating their own view of what their world should look like. This is what we raise them to do. But it's causing me to rethink, well, I better get rid of this stuff before I'm dead because they're going to just throw it in the garbage. The second thought is I have a lot of old things. We collect antique English furniture and antique English silver and all these different things. And I love old things. And I was looking at a tilt-top table. It was made in about 1810. And the catch was loose. So if the catch doesn't work on a tilt top, you put heavy things on the wrong side of it, the thing just tilts. And I was thinking, how many plagues and pandemics has this table lived through? And then I looked around my house. I mean, I have things that go back to the 17th century. And how many things have those things lived through and seen? Like, I have a spoon from the 1600s, like 1630 or something like that.
Wow.
And that spoon has been in the mouths of so many people who have had God knows what. It's just kind of an amazing thing. Think about those objects. But somehow that's very comforting to me, because it makes me realize that, well, the world goes on. And if these objects could talk. And then the final point I just want to make, which sort of came up in the context of everything you talked about, and I missed the beginning of your lecture, so I'm sorry if this was something that was addressed or not addressed, is how I feel when I get into a hotel room. And I sort of say, wow, it's a whole new space. And I can do anything I want in this hotel room, and I can make it my own. And there's one hotel we go to year after year, and we always say, come take the club chair and replace it with a chest of drawers, because the club chair is useless, and we desperately have little shelves in the closet. There's not enough space. We stay for a week. And it's just interesting to me how you make a temporary space your own for a limited period of time. And then when I leave, I look around and I open all the drawers. My mother always said, check your drawers, even if you don't use them, look in all the drawers. And there is this very slight sense of loss on leaving a space that was mine for a period of time. So anyway, those are three things that, there's no question in that. It's just sort of random thoughts on what you were saying.
That's so interesting, Lloyd. Thank you. Yeah, that's really, well, it's funny when you say that your son is like going through and saying like, why do we have this stuff? Or what, my daughter was on a rampage yesterday where she was like, why do we have all these magazines? What's this here? Why do we have to throw this out? Like, why are you keeping this? And of course it's like, well, look, this is my house, right? These are my things. And I don't want you to throw them out without me having a say in it. And you know what? My house.
Yeah, and this is the boy who, when Westtown was purging their library of a lot of magazines and things, he took a stack of New Yorkers, including one that was published on the week of my birthday. I was born January 12, 1962. And he gave it to me as a present along with a few others and said, Dad, you'll love these, So it's interesting, the evolution. He has contributed to the clutter on the one hand, and now he's in this purge mode, which probably has to do with his girlfriend, who's also a Hamilton student, lives in a more minimalist environment. Her mother is a Japanese art enthusiast, so everything's very clean lines. So, they go through their phases. So I'll leave the old things to another child.
Well, it's interesting. So another project I have is about collections, actually. And I was talking to one of my colleagues here at Hamilton who has a lot of collections. His name is Frank Siaka. And he was telling me this story that he said was this horror story. And it was about how this person who had amassed this really interesting collection, when she died, she hadn't left it to anyone, and nobody knew, like, nobody was attached to the collection the way she was. And so they threw everything out, and he said, this is just horrible. Like, how could this be? He's also like totally opposed to the minimalist movement, I have to say. He's like, who wants to live like that? We live with things because we like things,
Right. Well, I also have a hard time letting go of things. I mean, my wife bought a clean anti-disinfectant cleaning. I didn't like the smell of it. Most people would throw in the trash. I called the doorman downstairs and said, look, I got this bottle of cleaning fluid. No one likes it. Maybe one of you guys wants it. We bring things. We go to England in the summertime, and there's a village fair every year where they sell what's called the white elephant. The white elephant is the table of trinkets that people have just donated to get rid of. and they sell them for 50p or a pound or whatever, and all this stuff. We will take things that we're giving away here, say, wait, that will be a big hit at the village fair. So we schlep it to England and then donate it to the village fair. Feel so good about it. But why is it that I care? And so many other people in my family just say, Dad, throw it away. Why would you do that? I don't know. I don't think I can fix it. I just think it's just sort of who we are. I think it's more our genes and the way we watch our parents. My mom sort of saved things, and my dad took pride in throwing everything out. But he's the one who has the letters, the diplomas. He has a lot of family memorabilia, so he doesn't actually throw everything out. He just throws out a lot of things that anyway, I've talked enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have time for a few more questions. I know Hannah had her hand up, Delgado had his hand up, I think Samantha had her hand up, so maybe we can run through those quickly, hopefully. And yeah, but it's great discussion. I love it. So Hannah, you go.
Hi, Professor. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Hannah. How are you?
Good. It's fun to feel like I'm in class again. I think, Maddie, we had class together. So nice to see you. But I just had a question on whether there were any takes on if it was important, if the sequence of homes that we make is important. So whether surrounded by the idea of our capacity to make a new one or inability to really make a new one, and how, at least for me, my home is my parents' house, and I might kind of try to make a new one, but I don't think that's ever going to change. And so is that, in terms of the way we're thinking about place and space, and then specifically adding on the layer of home, does the order in which we have these spaces matter? Especially with that last quote, like, it's not necessarily positive or negative. Does the first one really have that singular importance?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because for me, I sort of feel I was the same way that you're talking. Like, when I had to go back, even though I had not lived in my parents' house for, I don't know, 40 some years. No, I guess 30 when my mother died. It was like, no, this is my home, right? Even though there is no way I could have lived in that house ever, I mean, it was just like, I was just like, oh my God, how do we have 5 people in this tiny little place, And I was just like, oh, that bathroom in the basement is disgusting. And there's only one bathroom in this house, like, how could you live in this? And I think you're right that there is, like, for a lot of people, even though, I've now lived in lots of apartments and lots of different houses. For me, like, I mean, I still go on Zillow and I look at that house that I grew up in, and I look to see, like, oh, they chopped down all the bushes, they chopped down all the trees. Oh, look, they painted it a different color. And it's, I think in some ways there's this weird way in which there is that imaginary nostalgic home that we have, even when we've sort of made our own. We've grown up, we've moved on to other places, and we have adult children. And I think it's very hard, I'm thinking about what Lloyd was saying about letting go of objects. I think for some of us, at least, it is really hard to let that go, and, it's hard to say, oh, this is a bad thing or a good thing that we feel this attachment. It seems though, like, I mean, I guess not everybody lives in the same house through their whole lives. And so maybe for them, it's a little easier to pick up and move to different places. But most of my friends who have moved around, there's one place in that, history of house moving that is home, like, that they think of as really their home. So yeah, I think it's just stay with your parents as long as they'll let you. But be nice to them. Don't throw their crap out.
Okay, occasionally. Yeah. Delgado, you had a question?
Less of a question, more of just a topic to bring up. Oh,
Can you speak
Can
up?
hear you, Mr. Corcoran.
is that a little better?
That's
Okay.
better.
Fantastic. Hi there, I'm Marianne.
Hi, honey.
Hi, everyone. It was just a topic I wanted to bring up because something came up in the nostalgia conversation that you brought up, Marianne, and Lloyd, you brought up your son coming home and throwing everything out. And I've been doing the same thing because it's in response to a challenge that I've seen. You know, I did a lot of growing up at Hamilton, 4 years, it'll do that to you. And now I come back home to the same childhood home, no rent, it's a great time. And it sometimes feel like no time has passed at all. It doesn't feel like I've accomplished much because I'm back in the same room. And so I think that can be a challenge. And I wanted to bring up the idea of like being trapped in a room, but making it space your own, that sort of thing, that sort of idea. So
That's really good. I hadn't really thought of that, but you're right. There's a sense in which if you have to go back home to live at home, you sort of feel like no time has passed and here I am, I'm stuck back in the past, what did I do all this for? Like I used to be an adult, I lived on my own, right? Yeah.
Okay, and I think, am I right, Allie? One more question? Allie's nodding to me. Okay, so Samantha, it's yours. No pressure.
Yeah, pressure's on. But hi, Marianne.
Hi, Sam. Oh, you know how to use the Zoom. Good girl.
I barely know. This is my third time. But Hannah, I really liked the point that you made about how you have this one first home, and you were saying that it was your parents' house. And I have been thinking this whole time about how we haven't really talked about how people incorporate into this whole thing and how people add to this sense of home. And I think that I don't even see Hannah on here, but when Hannah said that it's her parents' house that's a home, and that she's not sure that there would ever be another home like that, in response, I was like, oh, well, like, I think I'll only feel that again when I have my family, like when I start a family. And so I think that family is so important to this homemaking process. And I'm thinking also about my time at Hamilton, and I'm seeing a lot of familiar co-op faces here, and how much that contributed to a sense of home while I was there. And I had this time in the dorms, and it never felt like a home. I always felt like I was living in a dorm room. But coming to the dinner table and talking to my family about how my day was, and having people see my ups and my downs and like all of that, really, I think contributes vastly to a sense of home in a way that I'm not sure like I have ever felt the same attachment to objects or like a bed in the same way that I felt attached to like Maddie lived in my co-op, and I feel a sense of home when I see her, the same way that I feel a sense of home when I see my parents. So I think that's a really important thing for me when I think of home.
All right, so Sam, let me ask a question. I mean, because obviously, like your family, that your parents, for instance, or your siblings, I mean, that's one family. And then eventually you grow up and you might, I mean, you will grow up, but like if you start your own family, there's this other family. And so then, I mean, I'm thinking about like Hannah's question about home here too. And it's like, do you think it's appropriate? I mean, do we really have a sense that we have two different homes and they are both equal there? Or do you think there's some sense in which like, no, there's like something primordial about that home where my parents and my pets were, or where all my crap from the field days is, or whatever.
I've always been interested in that, and I watch my mother very closely when we go to her mother's house for holidays and stuff, and I it's interesting because I see a little bit of regression. Sounds like the wrong word, but I do.
No, it's exactly right. I know it. Yeah.
I see it, and it's interesting to see my mother not only my mother anymore, but like the oldest of 3 sisters, and like talking to her mother the way that I talk to her, and like it's not even the house that she grew up in, but I see that there's like there's the home that she's created for me and my sister and her and my father, but then there's this other home that it does seem a little primordial, yeah, where the second that she does go back there, it's different.
Yeah, no, I think regression, I know it sounds negative, but I think those of us who are adults who do that, I mean, it's part of what makes going home so challenging in some way, because you're like, I'm not that person anymore, right? I don't want to be that person, but you're somehow like drawn into this little dynamic, whether you want to be or not.
Yeah.
Thanks, love.
Yeah. Well, Marianne, thank you so much for leading such an interesting and engaged conversation, and everybody on the call, thank you for being part of it. As we were talking about home, I'm reminded, because I work in advancement, many of you are too young to remember Sid Wertimer, who was a famous faculty member at Hamilton, after whom Wertimer House is named, for those of you who are younger. And he used to say welcome home to alumni when they came back to campus. And we say welcome home to alumni when they come back to campus. And I know, speaking for my colleagues, we're all really looking forward to a time when we can have you back on campus, because we miss seeing our alumni. And we want to welcome you back to this home, to the nostalgia that can be Hamilton College.